Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is the line editor for the Rivers of London tabletop role-playing game and an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu. We talked about luck, which is a pretty critical game mechanic in Call of Cthulhu, but one that has been reinterpreted and given a lot more variety and usage in Rivers of London. Lynne talks about exactly why luck is exciting in the Rivers of London tabletop role-playing game and gives some advice on how best to use it. I'll jump across the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
Well, that's it, because obviously the luck spending rules are an optional part of the Call of Cthulhu system. They're one of my favourite parts. I think it's one of the best things that Paul and Mike introduced, besides getting rid of the resistance table. But that's an entire another conversation. um, no, I love the use of luck, both as a concept in the fact that you can make luck rolls to see if you can put your hand on something that you need, whether fate's got it out for you, whatever. So as a skill in its own right, it's brilliant. The option to be able to spend luck is also really good, because it's playing with fate. It's basically, the universe almost sees you fail, but then decides that you didn't actually. Maybe it was just a little bit of a warning that you're getting a bit cocky, but whatever. You managed to, succeed by the skin of your teeth. And it's a great mechanic to ameliorate duff dice rolls, because let's face it, we've all had them, even when we've got great skill values. Things sometimes, your pesky little dice just decide that they're having an off night, or they're being drama queens and they want to set the story in a particular direction. So having luck there to be able to spend it to just tweak things in your favor, so fate is favoring you, is great. And I think it's a fantastic aid for storytelling. It's also quite fun watching players trying to figure out when they should and shouldn't spend luck. And it is very much a double-edged sword, because obviously if you spend too freely early on in the scenario, you may run out of luck, quite literally, by the end of it, and not be able to affect rolls when it really, really matters. So basically, as you might have guessed, I love that luck mechanic. The spending luck points to help smooth out dice bumps is wonderful and can help take stories in a great direction. So I was really keen to push its use in Rivers of London, so that it's no longer an optional rule. It is a core part of the mechanic, largely because I felt that reflected the books more than necessarily pushing rolls, which is your other option for getting over a bad dice roll.
That's a great point to raise because it feels like luck and being able to roll luck, experiment with luck, play with luck fits in very well with the Rivers of London world tonally.
Yes, because let's face it, Peter Grant is incredibly lucky a huge number of times. I mean, okay, he's the hero, he's the protagonist, of course he is. But that also then fits very well with our system, because you have a mechanic that reflects that in the ability to spend luck points.
So, what is your answer? And this is broadening the scope a little bit out of Rivers of London to Call of Cthulhu, because obviously you've written extensively for Call of Cthulhu. What's your response to people who don't like the luck system because they feel it cheapens the risk of death or it gives players too many tools to use?
I'm firmly of the opinion that the more tools you can give players to give them ownership and investment in the game, it's not GM keeper versus players. It is a collaborative storytelling experience. And, if you give something to the players that gives them control over their investigators, and it really is control, because, it's like, well, that dice roll failed, but it only failed by a couple of points. Oh, yeah, go on, I'll spend a couple of points of luck. And then you can get that slow creep. So it is still, it's very much their control. They're deciding their character's fate by that drip feed of luck spends. I mean, you might get one where it's a case of, oh my God, that's 20 points of luck. I ain't doing that, because it's the first encounter. So you just suck it up and you take it. But if you then need to spend that 20 points of luck in the final encounter, when it's, if I don't do this, I'm going to die, that's got a whole other dramatic element to the story, which is great, because it's giving players tools that help determine their investigators or their player characters' fates, and that's fabulous.
So let's talk about running luck effectively then, because you can get into situations where somebody can push all of their combat rolls very explicitly. Can use luck on their combat rolls very explicitly to trivialize an encounter, or can be so unwilling to use luck that they find themselves in this loop of failure. What's some advice you have for GMs when they're moving into Rivers of London and they're going to be making luck a very important part of their games?
Encourage the players to spend it when it makes sense for them to do so. I mean, obviously, there are certain roles where spending luck isn't necessarily to the players or the story's advantage. So don't make players spend luck if they don't want to. It's always their choice. The GM keeper can suggest it, but it's always down to the player. Now, if spending luck is going to get them some extra useful information or it's going to make a real difference, then the keeper should say, oh, well, it might be a good idea if you spend luck on this role. Be explicit about it, particularly if you're dealing with players who aren't familiar with the luck system at all, or who are only used to it as an optional system, not as a core part of the mechanic. So play fair, encourage its use, but don't force it if the player is not interested. At the end of the day, always up to them.
When you're using a system like Rivers of London, you've got magic on the table always. Is luck kind of linked to magic in a way here? Do you narratively think that it would behoove GMs and keepers to sort of link that concept? Maybe you're literally using some kind of supernatural force to get you out of trouble?
Funnily enough, that's exactly how magic works for the Fae, the Demimond, who aren't practitioners. Practitioners, well, certainly the Newtonian practitioners and certain other schools, have very rigid formulaic ways that magic works. So you have magic points, the same way that an investigator in Call of Cthulhu would have magic points, and you spend those magic points to cast your spells. Yes, you can use luck on a spell casting roll. So yes, you are kind of at fate. You are kind of influencing fate to make sure that your spells work, which again ties in very nicely. But there is that whole completely separate strand of how luck does things in the game, depending on whether you are a human and a practitioner or whether you are part of the Demimond. You're not strictly human. You're part of the Fae. You're well, not yet, but you could be a genius, like a genii locorum, genius loci. You could be someone like the Quiet People or Zach Palmer. And you've got all these different types of people who have their own way of affecting reality. It's not the same as the Newtonian practitioners, but they can still influence the world around them. And when we were coming to design an effective magic system for anyone who wasn't human and a practitioner, it was a case of, well, how do we do this? And it was through discussions with Ben that we kind of came to see that, well, we already had the perfect tool, which was luck spend, because that very much reflects the way that the characters are influencing and changing the world around them by manipulating the way things work out. And that's exactly what luck points do.
So, as a final piece of advice, a lot of people running Call of Cthulhu, and I assume Rivers of London as well, have run into this situation where if you're playing a campaign, your luck spend is going to be very, very different to when you're playing a one-shot. When you're playing Call of Cthulhu, the option can just be, all right, well, we're not using the luck rules because this is a one-shot. What's your recommendation for how to treat luck in long-term play versus short-term play?
Short-term play and luck is great, particularly at conventions, because you can just blow the lot with, gay abandon, because heck, you've got one session, go for it, do it, have fun with it. As you say, long-term campaigns, it's a little bit different, but the tools are there, even in Call of Cthulhu, to allow luck to refresh a little bit more quickly than it would be. Technically it would refresh at the end of every scenario or at the end of each chapter if you're doing a campaign. Nice keepers can let their players see if they can refresh luck at the end or the beginning of each session. And he's saying the rules are in there. I'm a nice keeper, so I tend to let my players do that. It also keeps the game bouncing and makes it more entertaining. I mean, the way that the luck refreshes work, if you do that, it's not that they're going to be getting gallons of luck in Call of Cthulhu. They're not going to get it all back. It's still that, that kind of like, oh, should I thing going on. Now, in Rivers of London, similar sort of thing, although you do refresh luck a lot more quickly, particularly if you are a Demimond character, because they get all their luck back at the same time every day or under a particular set of conditions. So that, that they're, because they are wild cards, they can influence reality in weird and wonderful ways. We wanted to make sure that they actually had a good luck pool that they could just dip into and out of. The tools are there both in Call of Cthulhu and Rivers of London to allow you to let your players refresh their luck more frequently. I'm a nice keeper. I'm far too soft on my players, so I do let them refresh per session if we're in a long campaign. Um, for Call of Cthulhu, because it's more interesting because it still has that kind of, that they're not going to get all of it back. They're just going to get some of it back. So there's still that should I, shouldn't I? There's that thought and balancing. There's still that, oh, I don't know whether it's a good idea. And at the end of the day, it's kind of you're trying to give them tools to maintain their engagement, but you're also trying to make sure that there's that tension that helps develop really good storytelling and that whole leaning forward in your seat because you're really looking to see what the dice roll is going to do and how that's going to affect the story and whether or not you can throw luck points at it to change things. Now, with Rivers of London, if you're a Demimon character, because of the way they work, because they can really affect reality, their luck refreshes every day. They get the whole lot back because we thought that was way more entertaining. Also in Rivers, if you're very good, you can get an extra luck pool from various Genii Locorum. So maybe you do something that pleases Mama Thames. Mama Thames can give you an extra pool of luck, but you can only spend those luck points on things that would please Mama Thames. And if you don't, she's going to take them away again.